What happens when a world champion martial artist dares to kick a royal guard in the face, and the guard doesn't even flinch? You're about to witness one of the most shocking public confrontations ever caught on camera. This isn't just about a fight. It's a brutal reality check that flips everything you thought you knew about discipline, strength, and respect. Before we dive in, don't forget to hit that like button. Subscribe for more true stories that will leave you speechless. And let us know in the comment, what would you have done in Caleb's place? Stick around till the end, because the twist in the final seconds, you won't see it coming. The golden rays of dawn spilled across Buckingham Palace, bathing the cobblestoned courtyard in a warm yet unforgiving light. Among the sea of early tourists clutching cameras and coffee cups stood Caleb Morris, 35, an American martial arts icon known more for his bravado than his humility. Clad in a gleaming white tracksuit embroidered with gold lettering that screamed, "Morris Combat Elite," he exuded an aura of unapologetic dominance. Caleb wasn't just a fighter, he was the fighter. Three-time world champion, owner of a chain of luxury dojos stretching from Miami to San Diego, and a social media titan with millions of followers hanging on his every training clip and motivational quote. His Instagram bio read, "Flawless, fearless, forever alpha." And he believed every word of it. As he strutted into the courtyard, flanked by 4 disciples dressed in matching Morris combat jackets, Caleb scoffed at the immobile guards standing in formation. His eyes locked on one particular sentinel, Jack Whitmore, 30, tall and expressionless beneath the iconic bearskin cap, clad in the scarlet uniform of the Queen's Guard. Caleb sneered. This is what they call defense? He adjusted the diamond-studded watch on his wrist, a gift from a supplement brand he endorsed. Then, to his followers, "In my world, standing still gets you knocked out." Jack didn't blink. His posture remained statuesque, his eyes fixed ahead, the embodiment of military precision. But Caleb wasn't seeing a seasoned soldier who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan and 1 in Syria. He saw a prop, a man in costume. "Look at him," Caleb continued, circling the guard like a lion stalking prey. "No stance, no weight distribution. They've trained every instinct out of him." The tension was electric. Tourists nearby had started filming, some giggling nervously, others shifting uncomfortably. A child whispered to his father, "Is he allowed to do that?" But Caleb fed off the crowd, interpreting their curiosity as admiration. "Let me show you what real readiness looks like," he boomed. He slipped into a defensive posture, muscles rippling, feet sliding with practiced grace. He jabbed the air inches from Jack's face. Sharp, precise, and clearly calculated to provoke. Still, Jack did not move. From the edge of the crowd, Colonel Matthew Sloan, retired Royal Marine and a man who had led soldiers through some of the British military's harshest engagements, watched silently. His keen eyes studied Caleb, not with fear, but with grim understanding. He knew the type. A man who mistook discipline for weakness. Caleb wasn't done, not even close. "This isn't strength," he announced to the growing crowd. "This is performance, theater, and I didn't come here for theater." One of his trainees, Owen, a burly former MMA fighter, laughed beside him. "Let's give him a real show, champ." With that, Caleb took a step closer to Jack. His tone shifted, dripping with mock respect. "Respect to the uniform," he said. "But this is 2025. Soldiers don't just stand still anymore." He pivoted, and in one lightning-fast motion launched a spinning heel kick, his signature move, the one that had floored opponents across 3 continents. His foot sliced through the air and struck Jack squarely in the face. Gasps erupted. A woman screamed. The bearskin cap flew off in a dramatic arc, landing several feet away on the stone. But Jack didn't fall. He didn't even stumble. The impact echoed across the courtyard like a gunshot. For a breathless moment, time froze. Caleb lowered his leg, already forming a triumphant grin, but then he saw Jack's face. A thin line of blood trickled from the soldier's temple, but his expression had changed. No longer passive, no longer neutral. His eyes now locked on Caleb's with chilling clarity. Eyes that had seen war, pain, and death. What stared back was not a guard, but a combat-hardened warrior who had been waiting for permission. "Oh, hell," one of Caleb's students whispered. Colonel Sloan began pushing through the crowd, urgently dialing his phone. He wasn't afraid for Jack. He was afraid for Caleb. The line had been crossed, and Buckingham Palace was about to show the world that its guards were not ornaments. They were soldiers. Real ones. The courtyard fell into complete silence. Not the hushed anticipation of a curious crowd, but the eerie, weighty stillness that follows a mistake too massive to take back. Caleb Morris, world-renowned martial artist, now stood face to face with a living contradiction. Jack Whitmore, the guard he had just kicked square in the face, who remained on his feet like an immovable stone. Caleb's foot lowered slowly. He had executed that kick hundreds of times in competition rings across the world, Brazil, Japan, South Korea, yet never had it been met with such stillness. He expected the guard to collapse, to stumble, to even react. But Jack stood there, blood trickling down his cheek, eyes locked on Caleb with a focus so intense it pulled the air from the space between them. For the first time in a long time, Caleb felt something he hadn't in years: doubt. He opened his mouth to reclaim control of the moment, to say something clever, dominant, but his throat was dry. Words caught in his chest as realization crept over him like a cold shadow. This wasn't over. It hadn't even begun. Then, Jack moved. The rifle slipped from his hands, clattering to the cobblestone. It wasn't tossed aside. It was dropped with precision, as though its purpose had changed. And that was when Caleb knew. This wasn't a man standing still. This was a predator uncoiling. The shift in Jack's posture was subtle, surgical. His left foot slid back half an inch, his knees bent slightly, and his shoulders dipped in the faintest preparation. Every movement communicated danger. Not performance, not theatrics, but intent. Owen, the hulking fighter from Caleb's entourage, took a step forward. "Yo, champ?" he said under his breath, suddenly unsure. Something's off. But Caleb couldn't respond, because Jack was already on him. What followed was not a brawl. It was a dismantling. Jack's first move was a low sweep, efficient, textbook perfect, meant to disrupt balance rather than impress a crowd. Caleb tried to shift, but Jack had already rotated, his elbow crashing into Caleb's chest with surgical force. The air exploded from Caleb's lungs and he staggered backward, his hands up, instincts kicking in far too late. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't flinch. They just watched, frozen, as a trained champion was taken apart piece by piece. Caleb swung high, a right hook trained from years of competition. Jack didn't even block it. He slipped underneath, catching Caleb's arm mid-strike and twisting it in a controlled joint lock that dropped the martial artist to one knee. "Whoa, whoa," one of Caleb's students yelled. "Back off, he's not fighting." But Jack wasn't fighting. He was neutralizing. Colonel Matthew Sloan arrived at the front of the crowd just as Jack transitioned into a control hold, one knee on Caleb's sternum. Caleb tried to push back, to squirm, but each counter was met with a subtle adjustment, one Jack had likely used a dozen times before in places far more lethal than this tourist-filled courtyard. "Stay down," Jack said. It was the first time he had spoken. His voice wasn't loud. It was calm, controlled, authoritative. Colonel Sloan's phone dropped to his side. "Sweet Mary," he muttered, not out of concern for Jack, but for Caleb. Caleb stopped struggling. His chest rose and fell with shallow, panicked breaths. His eyes searched Jack's face and found no anger, no revenge, just lethal efficiency and command. "Get off me, man," Caleb rasped, trying to gather what remained of his dignity. But Sloane had already stepped in. He approached with a grace that still bore the polish of military command. "Mr. Morris," he said flatly, "you've just received a lesson most men don't survive to understand." Jack didn't move. His knees still pinned Caleb with unrelenting pressure, not painful but firm enough to silence any defiance. "What? Who the hell is he?" Caleb asked between breaths. Colonel Sloane raised an eyebrow. Before donning the red uniform, Guard Whitmore served in the Special Reconnaissance Regiment, 4 combat tours, 2 medals of distinction. The man you kicked in the face has spent more time under enemy fire than you've spent in a ring. Gasps spread through the onlookers. A woman covered her mouth. Someone dropped their phone. The reality of what just happened struck like a second blow. "Ceremonial?" Sloane continued, gesturing to Jack. "You mistook a still body for an empty mind, but in combat, stillness is survival." Jack slowly stood, releasing Caleb and retrieving his rifle with methodical calm. He returned to his original post, face impassive once again. Only the faint line of blood on his cheek remained as proof anything had occurred. And Caleb, once invincible, sat on the cold stone, chest heaving, ego shattered, realizing that while he had mastered fighting for applause, Jack had mastered fighting for his life. The crowd hadn't moved in minutes. Tourists stood still as statues, as if mimicking the guard they had come to photograph. The echo of Caleb's defeat still lingered in the courtyard air, quiet, haunting, and unforgettable. Caleb Morris sat hunched on the cold stone, stunned. The man who once walked with the swagger of a legend now looked up at Jack Whitmore with something dangerously close to fear. His body, conditioned through years of elite martial arts, now trembled from the brief but brutal exchange. He had been brought to the ground not by rage or recklessness, but by discipline, precision, training he couldn't comprehend. Jack had returned to his post as if nothing happened, standing tall, unshaken. The blood had dried slightly on his cheek, but his composure was undisturbed. Colonel Matthew Sloane stood to the side, arms crossed, watching Caleb with narrowed eyes. He hadn't spoken since explaining Jack's background to the stunned crowd. He didn't need to. The silence did all the speaking. But it wouldn't last. "Sir, security incoming from the East Gate," a palace aide whispered to Sloane. "DTA, under a minute." Sloane nodded without turning his head. "Let them know this is no longer a demonstration, it's an incident." Meanwhile, Owen and the other members of Caleb's entourage huddled nervously behind the tourist line. Their bravado had drained with every precise motion Jack had executed. One of them, Leo, whispered, "We should bounce, man." "No," Owen replied, shaken. "He's still sitting there. We can't leave him." But then something even more unexpected happened. Caleb slowly rose to his feet, legs shaky, pride shattered, but something flickered in his expression. Not arrogance, not defiance, confusion. He looked at Jack not as a guard or an opponent, but as something else entirely. What was that?" Caleb mumbled. "That wasn't just training, that was different." Jack, of course, said nothing. His gaze remained forward, locked into the ceremonial horizon. "You moved like you knew what I'd do," Caleb continued, louder now, voice tinged with disbelief. "You weren't reacting. You were predicting." Colonel Sloane stepped forward, his voice grave. "Welcome to the difference between choreography and combat." But Caleb wasn't listening to Sloane anymore. His eyes were locked on Jack, searching, re-evaluating everything. "I've fought world champs, trained with Navy SEALs, sparred with Krav Maga masters," Caleb said to no one in particular. "Nobody's ever done that to me." Stillness. And then, Another shock. Jack stepped out of formation. It was subtle, barely a full step, but in that world of strict ceremonial protocol, it was seismic. Gasps rang out. A woman dropped her camera. Someone muttered, "Is he allowed to move?" Jack turned, slowly, deliberately. His eyes met Caleb's for the second time. He spoke again, just 4 words. He crossed a line. The words hit harder than any punch. Caleb looked away, his ego crumbling under their weight. "I didn't know," he muttered. "I thought this was all shh." "And that," Sloane interjected, "is exactly why you were never ready." Suddenly, palace security arrived. 6 officers, armed and alert, moving with swift professionalism. Their radios crackled, their boots echoed on the stone. The lead officer, Lieutenant Harding, stepped forward. "We received multiple reports, physical assault on duty personnel. Who's responsible?" Colonel Sloane didn't hesitate. He pointed toward Caleb. "That man. He initiated an unprovoked strike against an active guard." Caleb didn't argue. He didn't run. He simply raised his hands, palms open, and nodded. Lieutenant Harding gave a sharp nod. "You're under arrest for assaulting a member of the Royal Guard on active duty." As they stepped forward to place him in cuffs, Caleb turned one last time to Jack. "I didn't mean disrespect," he said softly. "I swear, I didn't know." Jack's gaze didn't waver. His jaw tightened, and then, with calm restraint, he gave a short, precise nod, acknowledgement, not forgiveness. As security led Caleb away, Sloane addressed the crowd, his voice firm and instructive. "Ladies and gentlemen, let this be clear. These guards are not props for entertainment. They are soldiers, trained, tested, and proven in battle. What you witnessed today wasn't an exception. It was a demonstration of what lies beneath that uniform. Silence. Respectful, sobered silence. The kind that comes only after truth has been revealed with undeniable force." Back at his post, Jack resumed his stance. Blood wiped clean, cap replaced. But something had changed. The tourists no longer leaned in for close-ups or shouted for reaction. Now they stood at a distance and saluted with their silence. The holding room inside Buckingham Palace's security wing was quiet, eerily so. Caleb Morris sat alone, hands resting on his knees, his posture unrecognizably subdued. The arrogant world champion who once strutted into a royal courtyard believing he owned it, now looked like a man stripped of identity. His white tracksuit, once pristine and powerful, now bore the scuffs and wrinkles of consequence. The golden embroidery that screamed "Morris Combat Elite" shimmered under the dim light. But the man inside no longer radiated the same certainty. A knock echoed gently. Then the door creaked open. Jack Whitmore entered, not in ceremonial attire, but standard combat uniform. Gone was the bearskin cap, the red tunic, the stoic mask. Yet, somehow, he looked even more imposing. Because now, he looked real. Caleb stood instinctively. Not in defense, not with ego, just with respect. "Guard Whitmore," he said, voice quieter than it had ever been. Jack nodded once, precise as always. "The officer said you asked to speak." "I did," Caleb said, exhaling as if it took effort. "I owe you an apology." He gestured toward the chair across from him. Jack didn't hesitate. He sat, posture straight, unmoving, every movement deliberate. Years of training had carved stillness into his bones. Caleb swallowed. "I came here to impress, to show off, prove that what I've learned in the ring, that it was superior." He looked down at his hands, hands that had held belts, trophies, titles. "But I was wrong." Jack remained silent. Caleb glanced up again. "I wasn't expecting you. That level of control, that force. It wasn't anger. It was something else. Something I've never faced." Still, Jack didn't interrupt. "And when I kicked you," Caleb continued. You didn't fall. You didn't even flinch. That would have knocked most guys out cold. But you? He shook his head slowly, marveling. You barely moved. I've trained for 2 decades to be the best, and I couldn't touch you. At last, Jack spoke. I've trained for something different. His voice wasn't boastful. It wasn't even stern. It was matter of fact, solid, grounded in something deeper than competition. I see that now, Caleb said. In the ring, everything's about what people see, what scores points, what looks clean. But out there, he pointed vaguely, referencing the world Jack operated in. Out there, it's not about looking good. It's about staying alive. Jack nodded once. Different worlds, different stakes. I thought standing still meant you were weak, passive. Caleb's voice cracked slightly. But I get it now. It's not weakness. It's restraint. That's power, isn't it? Jack didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence was its own confirmation. I mocked you, Caleb said, shame creeping into every syllable. I treated the uniform like a costume, but you weren't just standing there, were you? You were watching, processing, waiting. You only moved when it mattered. Jack finally leaned forward, elbows on knees. Restraint is harder than action. Anybody can strike. Not everyone can hold back until it's necessary. Caleb nodded, slowly. You held back. I responded to a direct threat, Jack clarified. And I stopped when the threat ended. That's the line. Caleb's eyes burned with unshed frustration. At himself. I couldn't do what you did. I don't think I ever could. Jack looked him in the eye. You could, if you were willing to unlearn. That hit deeper than any physical blow. Caleb sat back, absorbing it. Unlearn? I've spent 20 years building this identity. Champion, fighter, leader. And that's the problem, Jack said calmly. You built a persona, not a foundation. You trained to win under rules. I trained to adapt when rules break down. There was no accusation in Jack's voice, just truth. Raw, unfiltered, and it stung. I thought discipline was just about repetition, Caleb admitted. But you've shown me it's something else. It's about clarity, purpose, knowing when to act, not just how. Jack nodded once, and being ready when it's no longer a choice. The 2 men sat in silence for a long moment. Outside the window, the faint hum of tourist chatter returned to the courtyard, now calm once more. Finally, Caleb spoke again, voice thick. They're going to charge me, and I deserve it. Yes, Jack said. No cruelty, no comfort, just truth again. I don't care about the title anymore, Caleb whispered. What happened? It changed something. Jack stood, adjusting his uniform. Then don't waste it. Caleb looked up. Thank you. Jack paused at the door, glancing back with something that almost resembled respect. Learned to fight for something more than applause. And then he was gone, leaving behind not just a humbled fighter, but a man who finally understood the strength in stillness. 2 weeks later, the skies above London were gray, the kind of gray that blurred time and mood into a soft, persistent haze. But for Caleb Morris, everything felt clearer than it had in years. He stood across from Buckingham Palace, not as a tourist, not as a challenger, but as a man attempting to rebuild from the inside out. The bruises had faded from his body, but not from his pride. Still, he didn't flinch when passers-by glanced at him with curiosity. He was no longer the man who sought attention. Today, he sought understanding. He had requested the meeting through formal channels, expecting to be denied. But this morning, an unexpected reply had arrived. Colonel Matthew Sloan would see him, and so would Jack Whitmore. The two men approached from the courtyard gate, Jack in uniform, his posture as exact as ever. Colonel Sloane, dressed in a simple black coat over his military blues, walked beside him with measured calm. Caleb felt his pulse quicken, but this time it wasn't from ego, it was humility, or something very close to it. "Colonel Sloane, Guard Whitbore," Caleb greeted, straightening his posture almost instinctively. "Thank you for agreeing to see me." Sloane gave a polite nod. "We've read your formal statement. And your apology. The Crown appreciates your cooperation." Caleb dipped his head. "I meant every word." Jack studied him silently, eyes steady. He wasn't cold, but he wasn't casual either. "I know I can't undo what I did," Caleb continued. "But I've been thinking about something ever since that day. You said I build a persona, not a foundation. You were right." Neither man responded, so Caleb pressed on. "I've trained fighters all over the world. My students think I'm invincible. But what I showed them that day was the opposite. I showed them arrogance, performance, and I want to fix that." Sloane tilted his head. "Fix how?" "I want to change what I teach, how I teach. There's a gap between sport and reality. I lived in that gap without realizing it. My methods trained champions for trophies, not for the unpredictability of the real world." Jack's eyes narrowed, but not with judgment, with curiosity. Caleb took a breath. "I want to create a new curriculum, one that includes restraint, discipline, emotional control. A fusion between martial arts and real-world principles from military training, where honor matters more than image." Sloane remained still. "You want to teach humility?" Caleb smiled faintly. "I want to live it." For a moment, Jack said nothing. Then softly he asked, "Why tell us this?" "Because I need help." Caleb's voice held no pride. "You showed me something I never learned, how to stand still in the face of chaos. That's not just physical, it's mental, spiritual. I've trained thousands of kicks and punches, but that, what you did, it was deeper." Sloane folded his arms. "You realize we can't endorse a civilian program." "I'm not asking for endorsement," Caleb said quickly. "Just guidance. I want to understand what discipline really means outside of the spotlight. If even one of my students learns to de-escalate instead of dominate, it'll be worth it." Jack exchanged a glance with Sloane, then stepped forward slightly. "There's a veterans outreach program in Surrey," Jack said. "They teach physical discipline to at-risk youth. We volunteer occasionally. No cameras, no press, just real conversations." Caleb's eyes widened slightly. "Could I participate?" "You'd be vetted," Sloane replied. "Thoroughly. And it wouldn't be glamorous. But if your intentions are sincere, it could be a place to start." Caleb nodded firmly. "Please. That's exactly what I need." Jack studied him a moment longer, then gave a slight nod. Not of forgiveness, not yet, but of consideration. "I'll put your name forward," Jack said. The wind shifted slightly. In the background, the ceremonial guards performed their routine, tourists snapping photos once more. But this time, Caleb didn't watch them with judgment or scorn. He watched with reverence. He finally understood what it meant to stand still and mean it. As Sloane and Jack prepared to leave, the colonel turned back. "Mr. Morris?" "Yes, sir." "Strength isn't just in movement," Sloane said. "It's in how you rebuild after falling." Caleb took those words in like breath after a long dive. "Thank you, both of you." As the two men walked away, Caleb remained rooted, watching the palace, not as a backdrop for challenge, but as a monument to values he was only beginning to understand. And for the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about victory. He was thinking about legacy. A month had passed since Caleb Morris had been publicly humbled in front of Buckingham Palace. It should have been the worst moment of his career, the scandal that ended his brand, closed his gyms, and erased his legacy. But it didn't, because something unexpected happened. He changed. The transformation wasn't instant or glamorous. It wasn't broadcast on his social media or wrapped in a PR campaign. In fact, for the first time in years, Caleb went quiet online. No new highlight reels, no motivational quotes, no shirtless training videos with cinematic music. He disappeared. Instead, he showed up, quietly and consistently, to a small community outreach center in Surrey. The building was old and tucked between rows of brick townhouses, a far cry from the sleek, modern dojos Caleb once taught in. Here, paint peeled from the walls, the mats were faded, and the heavy bags had patches sewn on by hand. But it was real, and real was exactly what he needed. He started as a volunteer, nothing more. No teaching, no name tags. Just sweeping mats, organizing gear, refilling water bottles. The veterans who ran the program, men and women who had seen actual war, treated him with cordial distance. Not unkind, but skeptical. They had heard of him, of course, everyone had. But they also knew what he had done. Still, he kept showing up, day after day, week after week. And gradually, they began to nod at him when he entered. One offered him coffee, another tossed him a spare set of gloves. Then, one day, they asked him to help lead warm-ups. Not the spotlight, just basic drills. But for Caleb, it was everything. He found himself working with teens who had never thrown a punch in their lives. Kids from troubled homes, young people who carried more emotional weight than any dumbbell could measure. They didn't care about his world titles. They cared if he listened. And so he did. He listened to stories of anxiety, of violence, of self-doubt. He taught not how to dominate, but how to breathe, how to control impulse, how to choose stillness instead of chaos. It was the very lesson he had once mocked. One afternoon, while helping a nervous boy named Eli with his footwork, Caleb saw a familiar figure step into the training hall. His chest tightened for a moment as Jack Whitmore walked in, dressed in civilian clothes, but unmistakable in presence. Caleb rose to his feet immediately. Jack. Jack gave a nod. Sloan said you'd stuck with it. I have, Caleb replied, brushing sweat from his brow. Wasn't sure if you'd want to see this place. Jack scanned the modest room, watching two kids sparring gently under supervision. He nodded once. This is the right place? Caleb didn't know what to say, so he just motioned toward the heavy bags. Want to run a few rounds? Jack raised an eyebrow. You offering to hit me again? Caleb chuckled, a genuine sound free of ego. No, sir. Not unless you ask me to. They stepped onto the mats. No crowd, no pressure, just two men, gloves on, moving in silence. They didn't talk as they trained. They didn't need to. Jack tested Caleb's defenses, not to embarrass him, but to measure his growth. Caleb responded with calm, controlled movements, more focused on balance and breath than flashy counters. It wasn't about scoring points anymore. It was about connection. Afterward, Jack pulled off his gloves and looked Caleb square in the eyes. You're not who you were. Caleb's breath hitched at that. I hope not. Jack nodded. Discipline suits you. Thank you, Caleb said, the words heavier than they seemed. You saved my life, Jack. Not just physically. You showed me what I really was, and what I wasn't. Jack looked toward the group of kids still practicing, under the direction of a retired commando. They'll learn the right things from you. I hope so, Caleb said, voice quieter now. I'm trying to teach them that strength isn't just force. It's patience, presence, responsibility. Jack gave one last nod. Then you're teaching the right fight. With that, he left. No dramatic farewell, no handshake. Just a quiet, respectful departure. That night, Caleb sat alone outside the center, watching the street lights flicker against the damp pavement. He pulled out his phone, stared at the blank screen, then opened a new note. It read, Strength is not dominance. Strength is knowing when not to strike, when to stand still, when to listen. Then, for the first time in weeks, he posted something online. Not a photo or a video, just the quote, with no hashtags, no tags, no branding. Within hours, it was shared thousands of times. But for Caleb, the only approval he needed had already walked into that gym, thrown a few jabs and nodded once before leaving. He hadn't just survived the fall. He'd begun to rise, finally, as something better. 6 months later, a crowd gathered once more outside Buckingham Palace. The air buzzed with quiet excitement. Tourists lined the black iron gates, cameras at the ready, but something about this day felt different. Like the calm before a revelation. Among the crowd stood Caleb Morris, no longer a showman, no longer craving attention. Today he wore a dark overcoat, no visible logos, no designer sunglasses. His once famous white tracksuit hadn't seen daylight in months. The man who had once kicked a royal guard in the face now stood respectfully at the back, hands in his coat pockets, eyes steady. He wasn't here to make a statement. He was here to witness one. The changing of the guard began with its usual ceremony, marching boots, gleaming rifles, and perfect synchronization. But to Caleb, every detail now carried weight. Every motion, every pause, every second of stillness meant something it never had before. And then, from the archway, stepped Jack Whitmore, fully restored to ceremonial duty. Scarlet tunic crisp, bearskin cap in place, chin high, eyes forward. He took his position with quiet authority, and despite the large crowd, there was no noise, only reverence. Caleb felt his chest tighten, not with shame, but with pride. He knew what that uniform hid, not just medals and deployments, but unshakable integrity. The kind of strength that had knocked him down, not with fists, but with restraint. A nearby tourist whispered to her partner, "That's the one. Guard Whitmore. He's the one from the video." But there were no mocking tones now, no laughter, only admiration. That viral moment, the kick, the silence, the retaliatory precision, had made its rounds across the world. News outlets had argued over it, influencers dissected it, and martial artists had debated every frame. But what few knew was how deeply it had changed Caleb Morris. He wasn't the viral punchline anymore. He was something else entirely. Back home, his dojos had transformed. The flashy branding was gone. In its place stood a new mission: presence over performance. His students, many of whom had once idolized his bravado, were now learning about mindfulness, de-escalation, and the silent power of restraint. The walls of the dojos now bore a quote in bold letters: "Real strength doesn't need to prove itself." It had become more than a motto. It was a truth, earned the hard way. Caleb had also become a regular at the Veterans Center in Surrey, not just as an assistant but as a full-time mentor. Some weeks he led classes, others he simply listened. He stopped talking so much about titles and instead asked questions. He learned from those whose scars couldn't be seen on paper. What surprised him most wasn't how much he'd changed, but how much he hadn't known. He hadn't known what it meant to be still under pressure, to respond without emotion, to hold a line, not out of pride, but principle. That was what Jack had taught him, not through speeches or sparring, but by not moving. The day after that fateful kick, Caleb had gone home bruised and shamed. But now, watching Jack from a distance, standing tall beneath the gray sky, he felt a sense of peace he couldn't explain, because he had been given a second chance, and he'd taken it. As the ceremony concluded, Caleb turned to leave. But before he could, a familiar voice stopped him. "Back again." He turned to see Colonel Matthew Sloan, arms crossed, wearing the same long black coat from their last meeting. His eyes held the same calm steel. "Yes, sir," Caleb said. "I wanted to see it all the way through." Sloan stepped beside him. "You kept your promise." Caleb gave a slight nod. He changed everything. That one moment, What I thought was humiliation turned out to be the start of the best part of my life." Sloane looked toward Jack, now rejoining the ranks, his uniform still perfect despite the biting wind. "You're not the first to misjudge them," Sloane said, "but you might be the first to actually learn from it." Caleb smiled, humbled. "I hope so." They stood in silence for a beat longer, both men watching as the guards filed out of the courtyard in perfect formation. "Do you think he ever—" Caleb hesitated. "Forgave me?" Sloane gave a small, knowing smile. "Jack doesn't waste time on resentment. He just watches who you choose to become." Caleb nodded, eyes lingering on the now empty courtyard. "Then I'll make sure I'm worth watching." As he walked away, the tourists returned to their chatter, unaware that one of the most powerful transformations had just quietly exited among them, not with applause, not with flair, but with steady, earned purpose. And in the stillness, Caleb found everything he had once tried to chase. Only now it stood within him. In life, especially as we grow older, we come to realize that strength is not always loud, fast, or flashy. The story of Caleb Morris and Jack Whitmore teaches us that true strength often lies in restraint, in discipline, and in the quiet power of self-control. Caleb, a man who had spent his life mastering combat and being celebrated for it, was brought to his knees, not by force alone, but by a man who stood still until action was truly necessary. For many older adults, this resonates deeply. We've lived through years where we had to hold back words we wanted to say, control emotions that could have overwhelmed us, and stand strong when no one was watching. And that's what this story reminds us. The strongest people are often not the ones who react the fastest or speak the loudest, but those who can remain calm, composed, and principled even in the face of disrespect or pressure. Jack's ability to absorb a physical attack without retaliation until duty required it mirrors a kind of emotional wisdom many elders possess. In our youth, we're taught to fight back, to prove ourselves. But in time, we learn that walking away, staying silent, or choosing dignity over dominance is far harder and far more admirable. The lesson here isn't just for martial artists or soldiers. It's for everyone who has been misunderstood, underestimated, or tested. Sometimes, life challenges us not to strike, but to stay grounded. Sometimes the best response is not a reaction, but patience. As elders, we have a responsibility to pass down this kind of wisdom. We've experienced what Caleb only began to understand, that character is measured not by how we win, but by how we carry ourselves in moments of defeat or challenge. Caleb's transformation from arrogance to humility, from performance to presence, is a beautiful reflection of the growth possible at any stage of life. His decision to rebuild himself not for applause but for meaning reminds us that it is never too late to change, to learn, and to live with deeper purpose. In a world that often rewards appearance over substance, Jack's stillness reminds us that silence can be a choice of power, not weakness, and that choosing to wait, to listen, and to act only when necessary is a form of mastery few attain. For seniors who have spent a lifetime learning patience, resilience, and discernment, this story is not just inspiring, it's a validation of the values we hold dear, and it encourages us to continue living and leading with grace, wisdom, and quiet strength. What are your thoughts on this story? Did the ending surprise or move you? Let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. If this story resonated with you and you'd like to experience more powerful and emotional journeys, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update. Your support keeps these stories alive and helps us continue sharing voices that deserve to be heard. Thank you for watching. See you in the next story.